background. Okay, here in my 5 references, I've got it set up. And before I finish with the tight kind of cutting out, and even before I finalize the placement, I might decide to make this kind of big boulder my furthest foreground and push this a little bit back. I'm not sure. Or I might use my guides and decide to crop this even lower and kind of blend all of this together. There are a lot of options still. Before that, and before I worry about these kind of hazy changes, I want to show you how we can play with colors and lighting. This to me is kind of the magic of digital compositing over traditional collage. Now, other things I can do at this step is because I've already kind of placed most of my things, I don't need all this empty space anymore. So I can use my crop tool. It's clear at the top, so I'm just going to draw a box that's a little bit tighter, still leaving me lots of extra space beyond what my original sketch was. But it will save memory not to have to keep all that extra pixel space. So I'm cutting it more than in half in terms of how much memory the computer has to save. And then of course I want to save it every once in a while so that if it starts getting hung up, I can restart it and not lose my progress. So the shortcut for saving is Command S, just under Files, Save. And it's saving as my PSD right in my assignment 1 folder. So how do we change colors? Well, let's start from the background and my first overlap, right? So here we have this really dark, moody, galactic picture, and then this on top, and that color might work okay. But then the next layer just doesn't feel like it matches lighting-wise and color-wise. So these are called direct adjustments. We're going to be using these a lot. You click on your layer that you want to affect, and then you go up to Image Adjustments. Notice we are not doing layer adjustments. Just like we don't use clipping masks, we don't do adjustment layers in the basic digital class, because those are things that augment our pixels rather than directly affect our pixels. And I want you to understand how to directly affect your pixels first. So we go to Image Adjustments, and that's why it's a direct adjustment. It's going to change our pixels in real time. The first one we will almost always use is in this first batch. So this is how adjustments work. These first 4 above the line, those all have to do with lighting, with highlights, midtones, and shadows. The one I prefer to use the most is levels. It's the most user-friendly and effective. The next batch has to do with color, and we're going to use 2 in that. We're going to use color balance, and we're going to use hue saturation. Color balance is for slight adjustments, which are incredibly helpful with landscapes. Hue saturation is for big changes. And those are basically the 3 direct adjustments we're going to use most. Levels for lighting, midtones, shadows, and highlights. And then we'll get into the color ones. So let's start with lighting. This is what's called a histogram. For any layer, it's going to show you how many dark pixels you have, how many light pixels you have, how many midtone pixels you have. Right now, there are more light pixels. You can see the histogram is more heavily weighted on the right side by the white slider here. It has more light pixels than it has dark pixels. So if I want to even that out, I can shift the histogram. I can shift the shadow slider to be right at the edge. And that way it makes whatever was darkest in that image a true black. And then I can also do that with the highlight. I could shift that so whatever is brightest in the image is a true white. but I'm going to ease those off a little bit. And instead, the one you always want to play with first in levels is the midtone slider. Do you want to shift it in general to the left? And that will make everything a little bit brighter? Or do you want to shift the midtones in general to the right and make things a little bit darker? I am mostly looking at just this background ridge, and I'm looking at that haze in the sky. And wouldn't it be convenient if I can change that from being a yellow bright haze to being a slightly darker bluish haze that blends well with my layers behind? So first I do it with lighting. I can't do anything about the yellow yet, but I can do something about how dark or light it is. And then the other tool we have in levels, which is really helpful, is we can set the limits. So if we feel like it's overall a little bit too bright, I can just limit what the maximum brightness is and kind of show that it's a little bit more in shadow. I can also do that with the maximum shadow. And the other great thing about doing direct adjustments is then you can just look in your history and see exactly what that did. So I changed it from this to this just with the levels tool. So lighting makes a big difference in your compositing. And that's something you can't do with traditional collage. Now I want to see if I can get that yellow mist to go a little bit bluer. So I'm going to go to Image Adjustments, and now I move past the lighting onto color. And the one I'm going to use, which I like to always use first, is color balance. This shifts the temperature of the lighting. So right now it's pretty warm, especially in the midtones. So I'm going to shift that warmth towards blue in the midtones. And I'm going to shift it from red to cyan in the midtones. Now in the highlights, I'm going to do the same thing. This is where you're going to see the yellow change. First it changes more to a whitish, and then I can even push it a little bit more towards a cyan or a blue. And then in the shadows, I can decide maybe to counter that or adjust those shadow colors a little bit. So I can make it really purple, really cyan. I want it fairly neutral because this is still in the background. So big adjustment to color there. It was like this before. Now it's like this. So we went from this to this with levels to this with color balance. And for each step, notice how much that step, that edge that I need to blend starts to feel more believable. And now it's almost matching so well, I don't even need to erase away from it very much. So when I do, I'm going to use a soft-edged eraser, pretty large. And I'm going to do it at a low opacity because I've already taken out the hard edge, so maybe we'll try like 30. Now when I do kind of sweep into it, it feels so believable I can almost be arbitrary about it. Just feels like mist off the mountains. So matching the lighting and the color helps a lot before you have to do these refined edges. Now you can also work it from both sides. So I just adjusted there, but I can also adjust the colors of the furthest background color reference. So first I have to rasterize it. And now I'm going to start with levels. And maybe I'm going to limit the blacks a little bit because it's mighty dark. And maybe shift those midtones a little bit brighter. Makes that star a lot brighter for sure. So from that, just pretty much black, to bringing out all that texture. That's pretty helpful. Now I can play with the next layer. Start with levels. I can deepen it, or I can brighten it. Just remember, you start with the Midtone slider. What makes sense? And you can always go back to this. Not only can you play with the sliders, but you can limit the highlight. Maybe I don't want that sun quite so bright. Push it back a little bit through the haze. Maybe I don't want the darks quite so dark. And then we can play with color using color balance with the midtones. Do I want to shift it all a little bit cooler? Shifting everything a little bit towards purple. Just feels a little bit more believable. Then I can go to this background as well and maybe put some color into that. Try with color balance. Shift it from blue maybe to a little bit more magenta in the midtones. Don't want to overdo it. Don't want to make it look ridiculous. But this is fantasy. Some yellows in there. Yeah, it's looking more believable and dramatic now. Okay, the next layer. To get these mountains to match now. So you see now all that works, but now this doesn't make a lot of sense. This bright contrast. And this is where I want this sharper edge. So I start with levels. Start with the midtones, see if it makes sense to darken or to lighten. Maybe I'll lighten it just a little bit. 0 in the middle would be dead center. Oh, no, excuse me, 1 would be dead center. So anything above 1, you're lightening. Anything under 1.00, you're darkening. I think I'm just going to lighten a little bit. I might limit the highlights, though. They're a little pushed back. And otherwise, the histogram's pretty balanced. There's a lot of light in it because of all the snow. But I don't need to darken my shadows that much. Okay, now color is going to make a big difference. There's a lot of yellow in that image. So I go to color balance. So all we've used so far are levels and color balance on each layer. They really help. I'm going to push it a little bit more towards cyan in the midtones. A little bit more towards blue, away from yellow. Maybe a little bit towards the magenta. And then in the highlights, let's see if it matters. I want to keep it pretty cool. And then the shadows, I'm going to bring that yellow a little bit back. Still have that greenery. Okay. So if I squint, and there's a lot of squinting in digital art, you can see the tone of the sky and those gray mountains. The value of it, the gray value matches pretty well, but the saturation of the sky is way higher than that of the mountains behind it. That's where hue saturation comes in. So we use levels, we use color balance. If we want to change the intensity of color or the spectrum of the color, we play with hue saturation. So I can make that sky match this using hue saturation. What I do is I just take saturation slider down. And then I can lighten it. And even shift